During the long years of World War II, there was one battle which was truly decisive. It was fought between two ruthless enemies in an impartially cruel sea. It cost the Allies 30,000 sailors and 2,282 ships. It nearly cost them the war. At the outbreak of the war in September 1939, the German Navy, which had only been allowed to build submarines since 1935, possessed 57 U-boats, mostly small coastal submarines. But 18 of them were the larger Type 7 U-boats, with a radius of 6,500 miles, which could operate far out into the Atlantic Ocean. Hitler had forbidden the sinking of merchant ships without due warning. Warships, on the other hand, could be attacked on sight. And a few hours after the outbreak of war, a U-boat sighted what her commander took to be an armed merchant cruiser, which he immediately attacked. The torpedoes ran true.
The submarine was the U-30, and her torpedoes struck and sank the passenger liner Athenia, outward bound from Liverpool for Montreal, with Americans returning home, and 128 lives were lost. Now, post-war research has shown that the Athenia was in fact sunk in error. But at the time, the memory of 1917 was still very much alive, when the U-boat blockade had nearly starved Britain out of the war. And the Admiralty took the view that unrestricted U-boat warfare against the British merchant fleets had been resumed. So, on that very first day of war, the Battle of the Atlantic began, the longest continuously fought battle of the Second World War. And during it, both sides would have victory seemingly within their grasp, only to have it snatched away, as the scientists working behind the fighting men devised new weapons and new countermeasures.
The first countermeasure was the convoy system, so effective in 1917. It was now aided by the then highly secret submarine detection system, ASDIC, which enabled naval escorts to keep the merchant ship losses down to 3 a month in 1939. And the Admiralty was confident that the submarine menace could be contained.
Unfortunately, however, that confidence was misplaced. The reality of the situation was that the submarine attacks were kept at low key for several quite different reasons. Hitler himself, scenting a quick and easy victory in the West, didn't wish to risk antagonizing America and dragging it into the war, as had happened largely in 1917 with the U-boat sinking of the Lusitania. In any case, in 1940 the German Navy didn't have enough operational seagoing U-boats to mount an effective blockade of Great Britain.
The capital ship of the German Navy was still the battleship, though their U-boats, in spite of their small numbers, were becoming increasingly effective. By the end of 1940, they'd sunk 2.5 million tons of merchant shipping. HMS Courageous, an aircraft carrier, and the battleship Royal Oak, sunk to the embarrassment of the Royal Navy at her moorings in Scapa Flow. Their success seemed only limited by their small numbers. The crews returning to their bases in northern Germany were congratulated by Admiral Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy. But Raeder was really a big ship man, unlike the man in his shadow, Admiral Karl Dönitz, then Commander-in-Chief of the U-boats, who was to make them a most formidable force. Following the German occupation of France in 1940, conditions for Dönitz to make his U-boat force into a major part of the German Navy were precisely right. In the first place, the Luftwaffe failed to break the RAF during the Battle of Britain, so that Dönitz was able to increase his U-boat forces considerably, promising that with it, he could bring Britain to her knees, as had so nearly happened in 1917. Large numbers of men were trained, and an intensive building program was put underway. The war in 1939 had come too soon for the German U-boats. Their planning had envisaged 200 U-boats by 1942. Before the outbreak of war, there'd been no time in which to build up the U-boat weapons. The German shipyards were now busily making up the deficit. And the fall of France gave Dönitz a priceless asset for the new U-boats, the Biscay ports, with their direct access to the Atlantic Ocean. Quickly the ports were fortified. While sheltering under these massive concrete pens, the U-boats were immune to air attack. Not a single U-boat was ever sunk while in them. And from these bases, the U-boats sailed into the Atlantic to attack the convoys, utterly confident of success. Half a world away, the battle line began. The strategy of the Battle of the Atlantic was simple enough. Britain could only continue to fight the war with the help of supplies from America, first on a cash and carry basis, then with the help of lease lend, and finally, with the Allied invasion of Europe, supplying the needs of huge armies and air forces. This unending torrent of food, weapons and supplies of war had to be transported in the hulls of merchant ships across the 3,000 miles of the Atlantic Ocean. The ships sailed from the eastern seaboard of America and were formed up into convoys. As many as 50 ships sailed together. United States aircraft could offer protection for the first 600 miles or so. Royal and Royal Canadian Navy escorts ceaselessly patrolled the long lines of ships. But in the winter of 1940-41, there were far too few escorts. These hard-pressed vessels had not only to watch for U-boats, they also acted as sheepdogs to keep the convoy together. No easy task, with many ships of different size and different nationalities plodding along at the speed of the slowest vessel. Convoys were graded either slow or fast, but even the fastest convoy only averaged 7 knots. And the men on the merchant ships knew that they were being shadowed by U-boats that could reach 17 knots on the surface. When the last aircraft had signalled its farewell, the naval escorts were the sole protection of the convoy. The danger was greatest at night, for it was then that the U-boats which had shadowed the convoy would overtake the slow merchant ships and position for a night attack. This German film, shot in the early days of the war before effective radar, shows how the advantage lay with the U-boat. Even when surfaced, its low silhouette made it virtually invisible at night, enabling it to stalk the convoy on the surface, thus defeating the main submarine detection system, ASDIC. The captain calls his crew to action stations. The U-boat increases its speed, driven by its 2,000 horsepower diesels, up to its maximum of 17 knots, faster than the naval escorts. It maneuvers inside the convoy. Torpedoes are armed and ready. The U-boat closes with its target. Tactics varied from boat to boat, but most commanders would crash dive on firing their torpedoes. A good crew could get a U-boat down in 30 seconds. Ballast tanks are blown, and the submarine dives steeply while the run of the torpedoes is being timed. They found their target, and the torpedo striking was usually the first intimation of the presence of a U-boat. The Royal Navy's counter, ASDIC, was the only possible method of detecting a submarine once it had submerged. It was essentially a series of ultrasonic pulses transmitted through the water and which a submerged submarine would reflect. The ASDIC transmitter receiver was fitted under the escort's hulls inside a protective housing. The operator could train the device to determine the direction of the echoes, which were recorded on sensitized paper, giving a continuous readout of the U-boat's position. But the Navy had greatly overestimated the operational effectiveness of ASDIC as an anti-submarine weapon, because the U-boat had a counter to ASDIC, a hydrophone, or an underwater microphone. This could give a bearing of the ASDIC from the sound of the propellers of the hunting vessels above. The crews would adopt silent running, since the escorts also used their ASDIC to detect the sound of the U-boat's machinery. A skilled hydrophone operator could track the position of the attacking surface vessels from their ASDIC and propeller noise. Creeping along on near-silent electric motors, a well-handled U-boat could dive deep to maneuver its way out of immediate danger. As the escorts tried to follow the U-boat's unseen movements with ASDIC, a grim battle of wits developed between the hunters and the hunted. The standard Mark 7 depth charge contained 300 pounds of Amatol. It could be set to explode between 50 and 300 feet and was deadly up to about 25 feet from the U-boat. Near misses could cause severe damage to the U-boat. Even small leaks were very dangerous, not because they would sink the vessel, but if salt water got into the battery compartments, then deadly chlorine gas would be generated. Effective damage control was vital. But in the winter of 1940-41, the escorts couldn't keep up the attacks. They had to stay with their convoys. More often than not, the U-boats could wait and then surface onto an empty sea. The wartime U-boats were not true submarines, but submersibles. They had to surface to recharge their underwater electric propulsion batteries. There was little danger at that time in surfacing, providing no ships were seen. The land-based aircraft were of insufficient range and left a large gap in the Atlantic. By the spring of 1941, in just 2 years of unrestricted warfare, a total of over 815,000 tons of merchant shipping was lost, a loss rate which the British shipyards couldn't hope to replace. For the survivors, to lose one ship was an unforgettable experience.
My boat was the starboard boat on the bridge deck, and it was our duty as cadets to go down with the boat until the officer should get into the boat. We got the number one boat down in darkness, of course. There was a little bit of a sea running, and the ship was still going ahead, still had way on it, and was going ahead at quite a substantial speed. My misfortune was that a Chinese crew member in the bow of the boat picked up an axe and struck through the forward painter just as we got into the water. Of course, the boat drifted out from the ship's side, was towed out from the ship's side, and came crashing back alongside 100 feet further aft. And that was where we had our one casualty of the whole incident. A Chinese fireman on the boat deck saw his opportunity to get into the boat, and he jumped, but he jumped too soon, and he landed between the boat and the ship's side as we got back alongside. She was a pretty tough-built ship, and she took an hour and a half, in fact, before she went down. And dawn was just beginning to break, in fact, when it was getting lighter when the ship finally went down. The stern went well down into the water, and then she stood up vertically and slid slowly and dramatically down into the water. Just as the funnel reached the surface of the water, it broke clear. There was an enormous noise of rushing air and bits breaking off as the ship went down. And then the last vestige as the foredeck went under the water really was, even to a young kid like myself, was extremely moving.
The U-boat men called it the Glückliche Zeit, the happy time. The captains became national heroes. Gunther Priem, whose U-47 comes home having sunk over 66,000 tons. Other names became household words: Schepke, Kretschmer. Newsreels covered their triumphant returns to base with tonnage pennants fluttering, and the soundtrack proclaiming with some truth that we're fahren gegen England, we're sailing against England. Safely berthed in their impregnable pens, it must have seemed that the U-boats alone could bring beleaguered Britain to her knees and achieve the victory that they'd been cheated of in 1917. To the U-boat Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Dönitz, it was the happy time indeed. But the times were about to change. The British scientists had produced a new weapon that was to revolutionize the war at sea. The strange lantern on the corvette's mast concealed the aerials of a new and potent radar, which operated on the then unbelievably short wavelength of 10 centimeters. This tiny dipole could focus a fine beam of radio energy which acted like a searchlight and was far more efficient than the crude early radars. It was called the Type 271, and though lacking in refinement by later standards, the aerial scanner was turned by hand, it was nevertheless effective and could detect not only surface submarines, but even under the right conditions their periscopes. It owed its success to the cavity magnetron, invented by two British scientists, Randall and Boot. it generated very high power at the exceptionally short wavelengths which were necessary for accurate radar. Here, on the 271 indicator, individual ships of a convoy return echoes from 6 or 7 miles away. Behind the convoy, undetectable visually, the single echo of a shadowing U-boat, showing clearly at 4.5 miles range. 271 radar was fitted to the escorts in the summer of 1941. It produced results immediately. No longer could U-boats attack the convoys under cover of darkness. They were detected and many were sunk, either by depth charges, gunfire or ramming. Many of the aces, men who had sunk more than 250,000 tons each, went down with their boats, including Gunther Priem and Joachim Schepke. Others, like Kretschmer, were captured. The loss of these and other experienced commanders was a setback for Admiral Dönitz. The Battle of the Atlantic moved to a new phase. Following the loss of his aces, Dönitz implemented a new strategy, the Rudel tactic or wolf pack, which was simply concentrating a line of U-boats across the path of the Allied convoys, which it was hoped Luftwaffe reconnaissance would be able to locate. And this wartime German film supports the idea. Long-range Condors, operating from bases at Bordeaux and Stavanger, roamed far out into the Atlantic Ocean. A convoy is located, and its course, composition and speed is sent to U-boat headquarters as the Condor attacks. The attacks took place far beyond the range of land-based fighters, and the Condors were for a time successful. But the answer was simple and had its origins in the First World War, when aircraft flew from the gun turrets of battleships. This idea was similar. An expendable fighter, usually a Hurricane, was mounted on a ramp above the forecastle of the merchant ship, to be catapulted off by a number of small rockets, so the convoy carried its own air cover. The early tests of this system were nearly disastrous, but it proved it would work. Hurricanes were placed aboard what became known as cam ships, catapult-armed merchant ships which sailed with the convoys. Although it was effective, it was a one-way trip. When they'd made their attack, the pilots had to ditch in the sea. But the principal enemy of the convoys was still the U-boat. There were now large numbers in the Atlantic operating as wolf packs. When one spotted a convoy, its course and composition would be sent by radio. And although the message was in a secure cipher, nevertheless the transmission could give away the U-boat's position. For unknown to the Germans, the British had developed a highly effective radio direction finding system, which could pinpoint a U-boat even on a very short coded transmission. The work had begun at the radio section of the National Physical Laboratory near Slough, where, as this unique film shot in the late 20s shows, a team of scientists had been investigating the nature of the ionosphere. Part of this work involved tracking thunderstorms. But they were finding it difficult to track the brief lightning flashes when using conventional loop aerial direction finding sets. However, the laboratory contained the then very new cathode ray oscilloscope. The oscilloscope was coupled to what was called the Adcock aerial, which was essentially two large loops at right angles, aligned north-south and east-west, which didn't have to rotate and gave instantaneous indication of the direction of any radio source. That early work at Slough was developed to lead eventually to this near-automatic radio direction finding apparatus known as FH4. It was fitted into escort destroyers and corvettes by early 1942, where it became known as HFDF, short for HFDF or high-frequency direction finding. And it gave those ships an instant indication of the direction of any signal on this cathode ray tube. It worked from an aerial array on the mast, which was essentially two fixed loop aerials, one aligned fore and aft, the other aligned port and starboard, and a sensing aerial. And the speed came from the fact that those aerials did not have to be rotated. So as soon as the submarine operator touched his key, you got an indication on the tube, and the technique was to tune out the ellipse, that is, tune into the signal, and there's the relative bearing. To get the right sense, the right direction of the bearing, you switched to your sensing aerial, which defined the quadrant from which the transmission was coming. And there we are, port 045. The escort vessel could either then steam down that line, or if another ship had obtained a bearing, it could fix the submarine's position. And a key point about this, of course, was it worked not just at close range, it could pick up transmissions hundreds of miles away and help to fix the position of submarines and surface vessels several hundred miles away across the Atlantic. In every sense, therefore, it revolutionized radio direction finding as an anti-submarine weapon. The U-boat signals were picked up aboard the escort vessels, and a great deal depended on the operator. One of the most successful of the wartime escort captains readily acknowledges his debt to his Huff Duff operator.
He was an ex-Marconi operator called Walker, Lieutenant Walker, who had been himself torpedoed and a survivor of a merchant ship torpedoed by a U-boat early in the war. And he had a real dedicated hatred for the U-boats. And as a result, when we were in the U-boat areas, he used to sit in his little cubby hole, which was the HFDF office, almost continuously, night and day, listening to the U-boat transmissions. He learnt exactly when they would shift their frequencies so that he could keep in touch. He knew almost personally some of the operators. He used to know their fingerprinters, as they call it. He knew which one was operating. He'd say, this is the same U-boat was talking 3 or 4 hours ago. He knew if a U-boat had just surfaced, because he said that one's got wet aerials. He knew that amount. And if he rang up the bridge and said, a U-boat has just transmitted, and I know it's on what they call the ground wave, let's say within 12 to 15 miles on such and such a bearing, I knew if I went out there I should find this U-boat. And time again, I proved him right.
By the end of May 1941, the Wolfpack's essential radio signals were of even greater assistance to the anti-submarine forces. The reports and orders were encoded by the German Navy's version of Enigma, known as the Schussel M. These naval machines were used to generate several different ciphers for different theatres of the war. And the cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park had not yet broken these ciphers, although they had for some time been reading messages transmitted by the German Army and Air Force. In May 1941, however, U-boat 110 was captured off Iceland in the North Atlantic. The boarding party got to the U-boat before she sank and returned with one of the most valuable prizes of the entire war.
They recovered the entire naval Enigma package, the machine itself, the enciphering wheels, the operational manuals, and perhaps most important of all, the instructions giving the daily settings of the wheels up until the end of July. The submarine itself sank while it was on tow to Iceland. But now, Bletchley Park, the code breakers in these huts were able to read the Naval Command signals to their entire U-boat fleet.
This priceless intelligence was passed to the Admiralty in Whitehall, where the U-boat tracking room was deep underground in an extension known as the Citadel, and it was here that the Battle of the Atlantic was fought. One of the intelligence staff in the tracking room at that time was Patrick Beasley.
One must point out that the settings for the Enigma machine, for the naval messages, changed every 24 hours and therefore had to be broken afresh. As long as the instructions which were captured were valid, no problem. Once those ran out, then the boys at Bletchley Park had to break the thing every 24 hours. And sometimes they did it without difficulty, sometimes there was a delay. And one must emphasize that for operational uses, intelligence of this sort has to be very swift indeed. If it's 2, 3, 4 days old, it's overtaken by events and only of use as background information.
Aided by captured material from U-110, the tracking rooms of the Admiralty and Coastal Command were able over the next few months to to follow the movements and the operational orders of every U-boat in the North Atlantic. Thus they were able to divert convoys away from known wolf packs, as this chart of German U-boat dispositions in October 1941 shows. Losses, which had been running at 300,000 tons a month, dropped to under 100,000 tons a month. With the entry of the United States into the war, Dönitz seized the opportunity for some easy victories, and in January 1942 mounted Operation Paukenschlag, drumbeat. He deployed several of his long-range U-boats off the eastern seaboard of America. Far out into the South Atlantic, they were refueled at sea by milch cows, 2,000-ton U-boat tankers, which could refuel up to 14 operational submarines at sea. Eventually, due to the activities of the codebreakers, every one of the tankers would be located and sunk. But for the moment, these resupply operations could be completed safely in the open sea without fear of interception. Not only fuel and torpedoes, but food and even mail from home. And according to the original soundtrack of this German film, on this occasion a sick crewman was transferred to the German tanker. The torpedoes from the supply submarine are man-handled into position. The Type 9 carried 22, and in the cramped spaces of an operational U-boat, the handling of these heavy torpedoes was a considerable task. Refueled and rearmed, the U-boats moved to positions off the United States coast, where shipping sailed as if it was still peacetime. There was no coastal blackout, and vessels were silhouetted against the lights. They didn't sail in convoy, and the few anti-submarine patrols were totally ineffective. The results were predictable and disastrous. The seas off Cape Hatteras and in the Gulf of Mexico became a killing ground. By July, the total was 460 ships, many of them tankers from the oil fields of Venezuela. A German combat cameraman films the burning tanker. In spite of the blazing vessel being visible for miles, the submarine was able to remain surfaced. They were safe enough, for the American Navy had learned nothing from her allies' experience in fighting U-boats.
There were many steamers sunk direct at the American coast and also within the Caribbean. I personally made my first cruise into the Caribbean, and I sunk one tanker not more than 20 miles from Panama. They must have seen the light in Panama itself.
In fact, so close to the coast were the torpedoes being fired that many were even found on the beaches. So weak were the anti-submarine measures that many ships in the Caribbean were attacked on the surface in daylight.
Da ist er.
Enemy. The captain of the U-boat scans the horizon for naval escort vessels. There are none. Air cover is also non-existent. So he decides to attack the vessel on the surface by gunfire to conserve his precious torpedoes. It's a one-sided engagement. The freighter is doomed. Internal explosions rupturing her hull. The ever-present newsreel cameraman records her end. This ship under surface attack didn't die easily. Unknown sailors on board engaged the U-boat in a grim artillery duel. The trained gunners on the U-boat, with their efficient 88mm gun, had all the advantages. Shooting at a much larger target, they couldn't miss at close range. As the German soundtrack claims,
Der feindliche Dampfer entgeht nicht seinem verdienten Schicksal.
the enemy steamer meets its inevitable fate. Almost any ship the U-boats found was sunk, even small coastal sailing craft. By mid-1942, the United States Navy had been forced to organize convoys, protected not only by surface escorts, but also by blimps, small airships which, being able to hover, were ideal for convoy protection. They were similar to the Royal Naval coastal airships that had been successful in the First World War, and off the American coast, far from any possible enemy fighters, they were able to hunt U-boats very effectively in the clear waters of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. After the war, it was claimed that not a single ship was lost in a convoy protected by the blimps. Apart from direct attacks, the blimps would signal the position of any U-boat contact to surface vessels. By early 1942, many British and Canadian escort frigates had been given to the United States Navy on reverse lease lend. In addition, the techniques of ASDIC, which the Americans renamed sonar, were also made available. Very quickly, with the adoption of effective anti-submarine measures, the second happy time ended. The standard depth charge was supplemented in 1942 by a new weapon, a multiple mortar. It was called Hedgehog, getting its name from the appearance of the firing spigots. Hedgehog had one big advantage over the standard depth charge in that the 24 mortars were fired ahead of the attacking ship. The slow-motion camera shows the Hedgehog bombs leaving the ship. They were fired in a precise sequence to get them to land in a 130-foot circle 215 yards ahead of the corvette. The key point being that in this way the corvette could maintain ASDIC contact throughout the attack. With the earlier stern drop depth charges, ASDIC contact was lost when the ship passed over the U-boat, which then often had time to escape. The short time of flight of the Hedgehog bombs, exaggerated by this slow-motion film, and the large 130-foot pattern gave the U-boats very little space or time in which to maneuver, and over 50 U-boats are known to have been sunk in Hedgehog attacks. But the most telling weapon in the Battle of the Atlantic was to be the aircraft. Operating from bases in Northern Ireland, Newfoundland and Iceland, Lockheed Hudsons, the first American aircraft to serve operationally with the RAF, were fitted with ASV, air-to-surface vessel radar. Even in its early 1.5-metre form, ASV could detect a surface U-boat at considerable range, although the presentation was crude by later standards. This trace shows a rapidly closing contact at 6.5 miles and slightly to the right. The aircraft was directed onto the target by the radar operator. At about 2.5 miles range, radar contact was lost in echoes from the sea, but at that range in daylight, visual contact could be made. The success of radar-assisted aircraft in locating U-boats on the surface was such that the appearance of any aircraft was sufficient to cause the U-boats to crash dive. By 1941, RAF Coastal Command aircraft carried more effective airborne depth charges, and they sank several U-boats travelling on the surface from their bases to the convoy routes. They were so effective that eventually U-boats would surface only at night, particularly in the Bay of Biscay. And then another new weapon was brought into action. The Lee Light, which had been designed and built entirely without official backing by an RAF personnel officer, Wing Commander Lee. He showed it to the Commander-in-Chief Coastal Command, Air Marshal Joubert.
He said, "Who authorized it?" I said, "Nobody, sir." He said, "Who did it?" I said, "I did, sir." He said, "Who knows about it?" I said, "Nobody, sir." He said, "Air Ministry know about it?" I said, "No, sir." He said, "MAP know about it?" I said, "No, sir." Then there was a bit of a pause, and I wondered what was coming. And then he said, "Right, let me know when it's ready and I'll come and see it."
The light was first fitted to Coastal Command Wellingtons, operated by 172 Squadron out of Chivenna. It was retractable, and during an attack, it would be lowered from the aircraft to be directed by the aircraft's radar still unlit. As soon as radar contact was lost in sea echoes about 2 miles short of the target, the light would then be switched on, illuminating the unsuspecting U-boat as if in daylight. Another version was fitted to long-range Catalinas, Sunderlands and Liberators, and Lee Light aircraft were to prove very successful, particularly in the Bay of Biscay.
The surprise effect was enormous, and I think it frightened the men watching on the conning tower and looking around. And when they suddenly are in the bright light of a searchlight and the bombs are exploding, it was, I think, quite dangerous for the submarine.
But the Lee Light was eventually countered by Metox, a radio receiver in the submarine, which detected the 1.5-metre radar pulses, giving the U-boat's crew a clear audible warning.
Beep, beep, beep. And when the aircraft had located the submarine, the beep, 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 beep get much quicker. But normally they didn't even locate the boat because the boat could hear the equipment, the radar of the aircraft on a much greater distance than the aircraft could locate the submarine. That's because the echo had to go back and therefore had the double way. Therefore, the boats felt very safe after they had the Metox because they could dive before the aircraft could even locate by radar the submarine.
By mid-1942, the Americans withdrew a large number of escort vessels to the Pacific, and German U-boats were now sinking 650,000 tons of shipping a month. By the end of 1942, worse was to follow. The Germans had broken the British naval convoy codes and therefore knew their precise routings. And the German Navy itself had introduced a 4-rotor Enigma machine which the cryptanalysts at Bletchley could not break, thus depriving the tracking room of this vital source of intelligence. Only heavy gales in the Atlantic in January and February of 1943 kept the convoy losses down. But Dönitz now had an average of 116 U-boats at sea each day, simply waiting for the weather to improve. This large fleet of operational U-boats benefited greatly from the work of the German codebreakers, and were now being directed in wolf packs to intercept the convoys whose routes across the Atlantic were known in advance. In March, acting on information supplied by German cryptanalysts, 39 U-boats were concentrated in a single huge wolf pack to intercept 2 convoys. In 3 days, 9 ships were sunk, 4 of them by a single submarine, U-338. Altogether, in March 1943, 39 ships in 4 convoys were sunk. Had the Germans been able to maintain that success rate, Dönitz's ambition of cutting the lifeline between Britain and America would have become a reality. But in spite of the appalling losses, the Germans did not succeed in stemming the vital flow of supplies, and they would never again come as close to achieving it. Although the number of sunk and damaged ships at that time was such that Churchill wrote later, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." Yet in a matter of weeks, the tables were to be turned dramatically. First, in the spring of '43, the British cryptanalysts, working night and day, broke the 4-rotor Enigma code. And once again, British scientists came to the rescue with a new radar, a maritime version of the bombing aid H2S, operating on centimetric wavelengths which the Metox sets could not detect. But far from being welcomed, there was a great deal of opposition to its use, as one of the scientists involved, Sir Bernard Lovell, recalls.
The interesting thing is that this was most bitterly opposed, and we were not allowed to divert any of the H2S equipment from Bomber Command. In the end, we made equipment ourselves in Tiari. We even fabricated the polythene cables, which we were then using to the scanners. CNC at the Chiven Airport had no faith in it. He thought the Bay of Biscay, where the Transiderio was a big place and we'd never stand a chance. But the result was dramatic. Our first flights took place in March of 1943. In fact, at the same time as the Ace-2S were being used to mark Berlin. And the U-boats were sighted at night because these were Lee Light equipped aircraft, and they with no attacks suspected. Well, after 1 month of this, during which I think there were between 20 and 30 sightings of U-boats, they became so frightened that they refused to surface at night and had to make the transit of the bay in the daytime. Then, of course, they were sitting targets for the day forces of Coastal Command.
During May, 41 U-boats were sunk, many of them attacked by aircraft using the new radar. If the aircraft were sighted in time, the U-boats desperately crash-dived, hoping to win the grim battle of the seconds. The time it took for a U-boat to dive to safety before the aircraft dropped its depth charges. The effect on the U-boat's crews is easy to imagine. Those that survived were late on patrol or turned back damaged. Again and again the aircraft were being successful, and with the arrival of long-range aircraft, they were asserting their dominance further and further out into the Atlantic, forcing the U-boats to remain submerged and hopefully undetected. Many, however, were not that lucky. By the late summer of 1943, a U-boat's chance of returning safely from patrol was as little as 1 in 6.
This was the time when Hitler remarked that the temporary setback to our U-boat campaign is due to one single technical invention of our enemies.
To counter these losses, Dönitz equipped his U-boats with additional anti-aircraft guns and ordered them to fight it out on the surface with the attacking aircraft. But the advantage this time really rested with the aircraft. Sunderland flying boats and other aircraft of Coastal Command continued the attacks in the Bay of Biscay, harrying the U-boats 24 hours a day.
Hello, Captain, calling all positions.
Although some aircraft were shot down by the U-boats as a result of Dönitz's orders, RAF crews devised a simple remedy. The aircraft simply flew out of range of the U-boat's guns while transmitting its position to surface vessels. The U-boat then had the difficult choice of fighting it out on the surface with the Royal Navy or diving defenceless and taking its chances of being destroyed from the air. Long-range aircraft and surface escorts inflicted such severe losses on the U-boats attacking the convoys that by May, Dönitz temporarily withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic. Another major factor was the narrowing of the Atlantic gap. By mid-43, it was completely closed by the introduction of small escort carriers, Woolworths as the Americans called them, which could sail with the convoys, giving continuous air protection. The problem, however, was the provision of a suitable aircraft.
There was really only one such aircraft available, albeit an unlikely one. It was the fabric-covered and wire-braced biplane, the Fairey Swordfish, originally designed way back in 1932 for the Greek Navy as a torpedo-carrying reconnaissance aircraft, in service with the Royal Navy by 1936, and by 1939, virtually obsolete, outrun and outgunned by the new and sleek monoplanes.
The slow Swordfish proved capable of operating from the narrow, short decks of the escort carriers. Many of them, in fact, converted merchant ships, still carrying a cargo of grain or oil in addition to their aircraft. In spite of its archaic appearance, the Swordfish sank some 20 U-boats directly and forced many more to break off attacks and lose contact with the convoys. Their achievements are a tribute to the men who flew in them. I flew in a preserved swordfish on a warm summer's day, and how men flew for hours in these open cockpits over the Northern Atlantic in winter is almost beyond understanding. They did, and landed back on tiny icy decks, which often pitched 60 feet from the horizontal in the Atlantic gales. German scientists, desperate to nullify air attacks, developed a Dutch invention, the Schnorkel tube. This enabled a U-boat to make a passage without the need to surface. The Schnorkel was similar in principle to the present-day tube used by holiday divers, the U-boat being able to run underwater indefinitely on its big diesel engines. But the Schnorkel was not popular with the crews, since waves could close the air valve, and the diesels would then suck the air from within the hull. A much closer step to the true submarine was the Walter boat, a small prototype, the V80, was tested near Kiel. It was powered by a steam turbine, which was driven by high-pressure steam generated from decomposing hydrogen peroxide. It meant the submarine could remain submerged for very long periods and had a very high underwater speed, 3 times that of the conventional U-boat. This and another high-speed U-boat, which had a much increased battery capacity, were however too late to see operational service. But their development had been watched with anxiety by Admiralty intelligence.
We certainly took in the tracking room a very pessimistic view of things. As late as April, really, 45, because they would have been such very, very formidable opponents.
By that time, improved radars and tracking procedures were making the task of the conventional U-boat all but impossible. But the U-boats fought to the very last day of the war, until Dönitz, the last Führer of the Third Reich, sent his signal ordering U-boats to surrender to Allied units. As the surviving U-boats surfaced, flying a black flag, the Battle of the Atlantic was finally over. It had been a hard fight. Of the 39,000 officers and men in the German U-boat service, 28,000 were lost at sea and 5,000 captured. And of 842 operational U-boats, 781, 93%, were sunk, the highest loss rate of any service in the war. One sailed up the River Thames under Tower Bridge, wearing the white ensign, and as she passed beneath the London bridges to moor at Westminster Pier, passers-by wondered at this small ship, which twice in a generation has so nearly defeated Britain, a major maritime power at sea. But although the U-boat had been defeated, the submarine had not, and it is today the undisputed capital ship of the world's navies.